Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining GATE1's webinar today on hybrid culture. Just to introduce myself, my name is Neela and I'm a digital workforce and adoption specialist here at GATE1. I'm part of our change and culture team. And over the last 18 months, I've been focusing on working with organizations to help them respond and prepare for remote working and now hybrid working also. We have a couple of people with us today. So the first person to call out is Tash, our fantastic producer. So she'll be monitoring the Q&A and just making sure that we're sticking to timing also. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Claire.
Thanks, Neela. Hi, everyone. So like Neela, I work at GATE1 and I'm in our people and change practice as well. I've got a big passion around any sort of people element where we need to set a strategy and then implement it and the benefits we get for that from a people perspective and an organizational perspective. Alongside Neela, I've been working a lot on our hybrid working model and what that looks like from a cultural perspective as well, and all the cultural components that go with it, and very passionate about it in terms of what a hot topic it is for us all at the moment. So looking forward to talking to you about it today.
So I wanted to kick off with this slide. Everyone is talking about hybrid, but neglect culture at your peril. So for the majority of organizations, some form of hybrid working is now the norm. You know, we're no longer looking to it for some sort of future utopian state, but for a lot of us, it's already here. We've spent the last year or so really setting ourselves up for remote working and getting to grips with the technology, whether it be Zoom or Microsoft Teams or anything like that. And we haven't really had an opportunity to think about what the workplace culture needs to look like going forward. We've just sort of been reacting to the panic around remote working and the pandemic overall. But what do we need to do going forward to get the right workplace culture to allow everyone to adapt to a hybrid way of working? I think we've been focusing a lot on getting the right split of days when it comes to designing our hybrid working model. So is it 2 or is it 3 days in the office? And the majority of people are saying, you know, it is 3 days in the office and 2 days at home. And so whilst we're focusing on what the right split of days is, we're not really paying attention to the cultural implications that a shift away from the home and back into an office will have for your company as a whole, or for a team, or for an individual's way of working. And I wanted to share a statistic that encapsulates what I'm talking about quite succinctly. And this was recently published by Harvard Business Review, and it said that over 25% of employees are planning to look for a new job post-pandemic. And one of the key reasons for this is the transition around hybrid working, and in specific, the shift from 100% remote working experience and now thinking about coming into the office part-time. This is inevitably going to create a different sort of culture, and a lot of people are feeling quite anxious about what that will mean for them as individuals. So it really does feel like it's the right sort of thing to be thinking about right now. So to take you through the rest of the agenda, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about why now is the right time and why we really do need to think about the cultural implications and not just sort of getting your policies out of the door and deciding on what the right split of days is. We'll then talk a bit more about what the important considerations are to getting hybrid culture right. So how can you make it a success? And then we've also pulled together a checklist of ideas, so things that you can go away and do as a leadership team or as an organization immediately to help you think about this right now. And a few housekeeping rules up front. So we have a Q&A capability open here function, and our producer Tash is going to be keeping an eye on all the questions that pop up. Please feel free to post them throughout the session at any point. You don't have to wait until the end, or if you want to share an experience or anything comes to mind, then please feel free to utilize that. And the webinar will be 45 minutes, so including Q&A. So hopefully that'll give you a bit of time to grab some lunch before your next meeting too. Brilliant. For anybody who is a Gate 1 webinar enthusiast, you might have seen our webinar around designing a truly digital workforce back in March. And I just wanted to emphasize that the sort of stuff that we'll be talking about today builds on the content that we discussed back in March, with the idea that it emphasizes predominantly on the connect layer. So, we're all talking about the logistics and trying to get that right, but and a lot of that sits across the enable layer, but now is a time to sort of elevate our thinking and think about the cultural components that sit at the connect layer.
Thanks, Neela. So hybrid is happening, and why are we talking about this now? I think we're all at the point where we're coming out of the pandemic and we're thinking about returning to the office and what that looks like. We're all thinking around how do we make it work? It's something new to all of us, but it's obviously something that we've all got to get right. So we just really want to talk to you now through some of our thoughts in terms of what the benefits are if we do get hybrid right, but what some of the challenges and implications are if we don't get it right, ahead of thinking around how we can think about it. So everyone's talking about hybrid. I think hybrid is probably one of these new terms that have come out of the pandemic that we didn't really talk about before, but as Neela mentioned earlier, most people are thinking sort of 2 to 3 days a week. The BBC did a research piece earlier, back a couple of months ago, which said out of the 50 biggest employees, no one's planning to bring their staff back to how they were before full-time in the office. And 43 of those are looking at a home and office mix, which is about 2 to 3 days. So clearly hybrid is going to be the preference for us all. I think from an individual perspective, we're all coming out of the pandemic thinking that we wanted a bit of a different work-life balance that we had before, and maybe a hybrid mix works better for us. And organizations are also seeing the benefits of it as well. So if we get it right and we have a successful hybrid working model, we do believe that from an individual's perspective, we can go back to that work-life balance and preferences that they want to maintain. I think what's really interesting to remember here is that the model for individuals looks different for many different groups of your organization, and that different people want different things. So we need to think about how we satisfy those preferences going forwards. I think from an organizational perspective, we've seen that actually many groups can be just as efficient, and if not more efficient, working remotely. So we've demonstrated that we can work remotely, but we have also missed the benefits of working together. And those are the points where we collaborate, we do more of our creative work in, and we come together. So if we can think around the best times to do that heads down analysis work remotely, and then what it looks like to come together and work face to face, and we get that balance right, there's a real opportunity to capitalize on those efficiencies and maximize the opportunities from working remotely. And I just think it's finally worth mentioning as well from a footprint perspective for companies, a lot of thinking around, do you still need the same size offices as you did before? We've heard a lot about some big organizations which are decreasing their office footprint. This is possible and obviously has kind of financial benefits if you do choose to do that. I think it's worth flagging that in theory you can do that because you might need fewer desks in a hybrid model, but we're also starting to think about how you should actually maybe think about using your office space differently. So you have fewer working spaces, but you need more meeting rooms, more breakout areas to do your collaboration work when you will be in the office. So there's a lot in there, and it can also be kind of quite positive going forwards if we can do that and we can tick all those boxes. It's a great opportunity, but I think we're going to get to a point where we realize hybrid is hard. You know, it's very different from everyone being in the office together or everyone being remote. We've now got a mix. We're likely to have most of our meetings where you've got people in different locations, but we need to figure out how we make that work, both from the tech and the logistics perspective that we've thought about, but those cultural components and behaviors that are going to make it work as well. So I just want to talk through an example, which is quite interesting. You might have seen it in the press recently. And this is about how Apple have gone about launching their new hybrid model, and in particular the communication they have and haven't done around it, and the backlash that Apple staff have done. So Apple have launched their new hybrid model, which says they will expect everyone to work in the office 3 days a week. This is quite a shift from where they were previously, because they had a real kind of full-time in the office model. And it's also interesting to compare them to other tech firms who are going for much more flexibility for staff. Apple sent a letter to Apple launched their model saying 3 days a week, we believe this is what you want, and therefore this is how it's going to work going forwards. But crucially, they hadn't listened to their staff. It didn't reflect what their staff wanted. So a group of 3,000 employees have responded and said, you haven't listened to us, this doesn't reflect what we want, and actually we want something much different, and we need to see some real specific changes in how you communicate, how you engage with us. So they've said, you haven't done any surveys, we want this built in, we want these forums built in, we want feedback loops in place for you to listen to us. I think this says quite a lot around the cultural approach that Apple had taken to this, not including staff and thinking about them. And actually off the back of it, several have already left, and many more in the letter to leadership said that they're thinking of leaving because of how Apple have approached this. So, it's just an example of how, if we don't get this right, and building on the quote that Neela shared earlier around how many people at the moment are thinking about changing jobs off the back of the pandemic, what the implications can be. So from a culture perspective, I think we actually have a really amazing opportunity now to think about the culture of our organisation, what we want it to be and where we need it to be going forwards. I think culture and engagement has naturally been different over the pandemic. And where we look back in terms of where we were pre-pandemic, we've had to change, working remotely, what that looks like from a cultural components, how we engage staff perspective. And that's just something that's naturally evolved, really, because we've been focusing on surviving as organizations rather than necessarily investing in culture, people and engagement. But now is perhaps the time to dial that up a bit. So there's a few options, I think, in terms of where we are. We could continue to let the culture of our organization evolve on its own as we go back into a hybrid model, see what happens, see how people engage, see what kind of comes back into our culture and what the behaviors are. We can make a conscious choice to restore it to the previous culture. So what were those big cultural components that landed before? Let's bring those back in and really try and focus on building that culture we had previously. Or we could make a deliberate decision now to evolve the culture. So we think about, okay, well, where is our organization now? How are we going to work going forward? And therefore, what's the culture we need to underpin that? And what's that going to be made up of? What's it going to look like for our people, our teams, our organization? And I think, there's not necessarily a right or wrong way here, but if we believe that culture, communications and engagement are all going to be really key to getting hybrid right, then we probably need to make a conscious decision around it and be thoughtful in terms of what does culture and engagement look like in our hybrid model and world to make it successful. So just a thought there in terms of culture. And then I just want to touch base on values and behaviors. So we believe that culture is made up of values and behaviors. If we make the assumption that our organizational values haven't changed, then we need to consider what our behaviors look like that reflect that now going forwards. Our behaviors have changed in terms of how we work over the pandemic, and they'll need to change again when we go back to the office and work in a hybrid way. So how do we work with people in split locations? How do we work on different days in the organization? And then we need to think about how our values manifest themselves into behaviors and how that feeds into our approach for returning to the office. There's something here around how do we reflect our values in the design of our hybrid working model? How do we make sure we hold tight to those? But then also, how do they play out when we're working in a hybrid way going forwards as well? And thinking about these things together, I think will really inform some of those cultural components that we think are going to be really critical from a hybrid working model perspective. Neela, do you want to take us through a couple of examples in particular around values?
Yes. So just to bring what Claire said to life a little bit more. At Gate 1, our values are candor, humility, aspiration, entrepreneurship, grit, and empathy. They were our values before the pandemic, they were our values throughout remote working, and they're going to be our values going forward. So these haven't changed for us, but what will need to change as we transition into hybrid working, or we continue to evolve our hybrid ways of working, are the behaviours that sit alongside these values and the ways in which we recognise these values and behaviours too. And so what does that mean, in a practical sense? So we are a management consultancy firm. We often work as part of new project delivery teams. And so, this month I might be working with Claire, and in 3 months' time I'll be working as part of a new team. And to ensure that we're staying true to our value of empathy and candor, as part of our new project kickoffs at the project initiation phase, we'll focus on designing a hybrid team charter and running a hybrid ways of working session, so that we're ensuring we really understand how team members want to work with each other, what needs they have outside of the workplace, and ensuring there's transparency across the board there, so that you can effectively plan how you're going to work as a team going forward. So for example, when we had our session a couple of months ago, one of the things that I was very clear was that on Tuesdays, I have an exercise class that I like to get to at 7 o'clock. And so just being really transparent about those sorts of things, just because you're not seeing me online at a certain time doesn't mean that things are not going to get done. And we're being very explicit about that. Great. So I wanted to call out a couple of additional case studies about returning to the office. And the key message here being that whatever that looks like for you, it needs to be designed with the right culture in mind. And with these specific organizations, so IBM and Yahoo, they were early adopters of remote working models. So a long time before the pandemic, a long time before the rest of us sort of embraced it. Both of these case studies took place around 2013. And they embraced remote working, and then shortly after, both transitioned their workforces back into the office for in favor of physical collaboration. And the way in which those set of messages was delivered, well, it wasn't received very well by staff. It resulted in a higher turnover and a loss of market share too. So whilst favouring in-office work in itself is not wrong in any way, there are clear benefits to that. The way in which that transition was managed and delivered to the rest of the organisation didn't quite land, and it wasn't done with the right culture in mind. And the reason why I wanted to highlight these two organizations and these case studies in specific is because they took place outside of a COVID-19 scenario. A lot of the things that have been difficult in the last year and a half can be attributed to the pandemic, but this isn't really the case in 2013. So even sort of putting that aside and as a extenuating variable, we'll say, for culture, it still can go wrong. So you really do need to get the cultural components and the engagement as part of that right. And I think since this happened, it's almost a decade ago, there are generational components and employee expectations to keep in mind. So people expect flexibility and options to be available to them, and if you can't respond to that as an organization, or you can't tackle that in your messaging, then people are likely to go somewhere else and find an organization that can handle that. So a lot of that was around sort of what can go wrong and what hasn't quite landed. So let's spend a bit of time talking about the key considerations for getting hybrid culture right. And we have come up with these three key considerations. So inclusivity, enterprise agility, and growth mindset. And just before I delve into what those things mean and how you can use them in your cultural thinking going forward, I just wanted to call out that these are based on a set of roundtable discussions that we've held with GATE1 clients. It's reflected in the work that we've delivered more broadly in the last year. And finally, it's also the things that we paid attention to as we developed our own hybrid working model too. So that there is a lot of thinking that sits behind this. So at a high level then, inclusivity, ensuring that you're designing for your people and not for your office space. Enterprise agility is thinking about honing the organizational muscle that will allow you to react and adapt to changes that are needed with your hybrid ways of working. And then growth mindset is about empowering your employees to be able to tackle things outside of their comfort zone, and they may be placed out of their comfort zone quite a bit as they transition to hybrid working too. And digging a bit deeper into inclusivity then, before you roll out a model, so both Claire and I sort of mentioned earlier that it feels like for a lot of organizations, 2 to 3 days is the way forward. Before you go ahead and do that, the first thing you need to do is to truly understand what it is that your people want from a hybrid working model. And therefore, what are you going to design and deliver as a result of that? You shouldn't be doing it because Google is doing it or because your competitors are doing it. You should be doing it because it reflects the needs of your employees. And thinking about how you can provide a range of, or cater to a range of working patterns that people want. It's quite unlikely that everybody is going to want exactly the same thing. So how do you build enough personalization and flexibility in the model that you offer to help retain your talent and attract new talent too? And so thinking about inclusivity really needs to go far beyond surveys and asking people what it is they want. You need to be bringing your DE&I mindset into it too. So we've spent, in the last couple of years, a lot of time talking about what diversity and inclusion means in the workplace. And you need to make sure that all of that learning that has come into the workplace more recently because of various important social movements is being reflected in your hybrid working model. And it's not just about you said this, so we're doing this. And we will now move on, that was my final point, sorry, into enterprise agility. So if inclusivity is about really listening to your people and then understanding what different groups want and being able to respond to that, enterprise agility will allow you to continuously react and run in new directions. And so once you have rolled out your new model and you see that certain components of that could be improved or aren't quite landing, do you have the ability to be able to quickly do something about it? Can you tweak your model quickly to adapt to the needs of your company? Or is it going to take you another 4 months to get a design group together and make sure that you have sign off from the top? So making sure that you have the enterprise agility to continuously develop your model and respond to what it is that people are saying. And so you've got your inclusivity component, you've listened to what people have said, you have the ability to be able to do something about it as an organization. The final component of this is around growth mindset. And this is really focusing on the individual's ability to embrace change and to develop, grow, and to respond to the challenges that are being presented by hybrid working. And ensuring that you are focusing on growth mindset and really encouraging it as part of your culture will mean that developing your model going forward isn't just something that lies with the leadership level, but it's something that everyone on the ground can respond to, so they can identify issues, they feel empowered to do something about it, and continuously develop the way in which we work going forward. So it's not just the sole responsibility of leadership, but it's actually the responsibility of everyone on the ground too. So, oh, sorry, Claire, did you?
No, sorry, you go.
I was just about to tie the loop back, but for this to be able to work, you need to make sure that you're inclusive and listening to people, and then you have the ability to be able to do something about it. So, you know, you can't just sort of pick one of these components. You need to be able to respond to all three of them.
Yeah, thanks, Neela. And I think, you know, building on that, we also think they build upon each other in terms of from a cultural perspective. They're obviously the cultural components that we need. For all of those as well, there is an operating model, a process, and a tech element as well. But from where we are today, they're really, we think, the three key considerations from a culture and engagement perspective for getting this right going forward. I'm just going to pause there before we go on to the final section, which is our checklist, because we've had a couple of questions come in. So I just thought we would take them. So the first question is, the leaders of our business want people back in the office full time, but that's not what people want going forwards. How can we manage this in balance? I think this is a really interesting question, and I think we have to remember that you know, that they're the historic ways of working, and there is a natural inclination to want to go back to that, because that's kind of what we've known, you know, previously. But I think we do need to really understand what different groups of people want going forwards. You know, we have got a range of people in organisations. Some people are desperate to get back into the office because, you know, there's a big social element for them. Other people want to only be in a few days because it's a different kind of work-life balance. So I think we need to understand as leaders what people want, and then, you know, the implications that if we can't design a model that does work for them, what the fallout could be. You know, there are more options now for people in terms of where they work and what the models look like. And I think something that's been really key coming out of the pandemic is that employees now actually have a far greater voice in terms of how they work, and working patterns and models are going forwards. And we really need to listen to that. You know, the only final thing I would say is, if there's a fundamental trust issue in terms of not having people in the office full time, and sometimes there is, if there's a question around kind of quality and value of work, then, you know, perhaps manage that separately. But ultimately, we really do need to listen to people and design that model for the people of our organisation that we've got. And then the other question that's come in is around different teams wanting different working models and thoughts in terms of how we can make this work. So I alluded to that there in terms of, you know, there's a spectrum in terms of how people want to work, everything from back in the office 5 days to fully remote, and are we going to make that work? I think one of the approaches we've taken internally is having a flexible framework model that provides guidance to people, and recognises that different teams need to be in the office different levels of time. So, you know, marketing teams, creative teams might actually need to be in the office more than finance teams who are doing a lot of analysis. But if we can have a flexible approach, so we're not changing contracts and policies, because to Neela's point around our enterprise agility, that's going to be quite hard to move out of that quickly as well. But we provide flexible options, guidelines to people that satisfies those different employee personas. And when we really understand those as well, that should hopefully go some way to trying to satisfy what different people want. Neela, have you got any other thoughts on those in terms of those points?
Not for those points, but Sam has asked a really good question in the chat that digs a bit deeper into the question you just answered. So Sam says, we've done a lot of asking and listening, and the key bits for us is almost everyone wants something different, but are also looking for rules to work to. That's our challenge right now. Also, our inclusivity challenge is to ensure we can be equitable as we run a retail business. So hybrid isn't really an option for us. So I think there's two questions in there. Why don't I just start by answering the second one, in that hybrid isn't an option for retail staff. That's true. and whilst you may not be able to offer them some form of remote working, you can offer increased flexibility in other parts of their employee experience. So if you can't, allow them to work from home 2 days a week because they need to be in Marble Arch, for example, can you offer them a greater choice in, what shifts they choose, what hours they select, other parts of their contract. So I think a lot of people will, in the retail world, accept that working from home is an option for them, but can you give them some other options?
Yeah, and I think as a culture as a big topic is quite an interesting kind of challenge for retail and hospitality industries as well at the moment, because kind of frontline people have had a tough deal of it over the last few months. So I think recognizing where those teams are, and maybe just thinking about kind of, is this time for a bit of a culture reboot for operations functions now, and kind of, what's going to make a big difference to them, building on some of those options and Neela said in terms of might be other ways to help those teams.
And the first part of that question was around, well, everybody wants slightly different things. How can we respond to that? And I think Claire addressed that as part of the earlier question. You can provide the general framework and the overall guidelines, but it's not possible to create a set of policies for every single scenario. That framework and those guidelines need to go hand in hand with the level of trust that individual teams can take that and co-create the next level of ways of working that is right for them. So offering a level of personalization alongside the overall model, I think is a way to respond to that.
Yeah, and I think just the final point on that is an implication of that approach and model is the implication on leaders and managers in that. So if you are providing a framework with guidelines, but you're putting your trust in teams to work how and when they need to, then we need to support managers, because it's a slightly different way of working in terms of how they ensure their teams are working where they need to be when. And providing managers with those skills to make that work with their teams, because it's probably going to be a slightly different level of conversation that they're having, and it might be tricky when members of the same team want to work quite differently, and they've got to kind of make something work for the team holistically. So we're thinking around supports, upskilling that managers need at this time as they roll it out as well. So I'm just going to go on to a few things that you can do now. Wherever you are on this hybrid return to work design implementation perspective, it's going to take about 5 minutes, and then we will have some time for Q&A at the end as well. So if you have got any other questions, please just pop them into the box and we'll pick them up in a few minutes. So we're really conscious that we are all on a spectrum. I know some people have totally defined their return to office post-pandemic working models. They've got new floor plans in terms of what the desks look like, the meetings look like, how it's going to work with different teams coming in together. And you're looking to like soft launch it now going forwards. Others are just kind of getting to the point where you're recognizing, oh, this is happening and we've got to think about it. May not be rolling it out until September or when the guidelines from governance allow us to. So we're in different places, but there are some quite practical things that, as Neela mentioned earlier, as leaders or as the organisation can start to do now in both the design and rollout of it. So we've tried to build this checklist for you around the 3 elements we spoke about earlier. So inclusivity, enterprise agility, growth mindset, with some real tangibles about what that looks like. We will send out a checklist with the recording of this webinar for you, so you've got it, but just want to talk through a couple of those examples now. So inclusivity, we've said that is really around seeking input and feedback from your staff, listening and really doing what you hear where possible. So what does that look like? It looks like employee surveys, it looks like one-to-ones with people, it looks like pulling together engagement forums to hear from people, it looks like coming up with models and then testing some of them to provide feedback, seeing what people think. I would, urge us to think about that going forwards, both, as we design it and roll it out as well. But to the Apple example, reflect back what you're saying, be honest in it as well. Enterprise agility. So a big one is communicate. I think, if nothing else, people want to know where organizations are in terms of their hybrid working models. It can become quite an anxiety raising issue if people don't know what their working models look like going forwards. And people are just appreciating extra communication from organizations on some of these big ticket items at the moment off the back of the year. So, regular updates in terms of this is where we are, we're starting to think about it, we're pulling these people together in terms of the design, we're going to update you again in 2 weeks' time on what that looks like. We think we're going to roll this out from the 1st of September. Lots of communication opportunities like that are landing really well with people and making quite a big difference in terms of how they feel about the organization and the culture that's behind it. And then we've said around, what's really important is that we can adapt quickly to what any changes we need to make. So there's something quite practical around, do we have governance and decision-making processes in place that are going to allow us to make those quick changes that we might need to going forward. So we're not going to be bogged down in, finances that we can't access, or deep governance that mean we can't make changes or decisions for months at a time, but that we can work in quite an agile way with this going forward. Growth mindset. So this is around individuals having that ability to push themselves out of the boundaries with this. It's a different way of working, but how can we equip them to have the confidence and skills to work in a slightly different way and be comfortable in that way? So we think you can just do a quick values and behaviors check against your working model. What are our values as an organization? What does that look like going forwards? How are we going to reward those values at the end of the year? How are they going to be recognized going forwards? And what are the behaviors that are going to be needed to work successfully going forwards? And what does that look like, for example, in growth mindset? And then one for leaders, role modeling healthy hybrid working. So if we're saying people need to be in the office 3 days a week, then ideally we want to see leaders doing the same thing, so that everyone across the organization can see that's okay to work like that. We don't need to be in full time. And then there's a lot of tech we have now at our fingertips to make hybrid working successful. I would urge leaders to try and start using these tech tools that we have as well to demonstrate how we can make it work from a practical perspective as well. So, Neela, anything else to add from your perspective on that checklist?
I'd say that final point around leaders sort of embodying the behaviours that you're expecting of your staff, I think that goes both ways. So it's both about, are you in the office 5 days a week when the model says, 2 or 3 days a week, but it's also, if you're asking people to come into the office a couple of days a week, making sure that you are then not working 5 days a week from home. So it's both ways. Make sure that it's being reflected across the board. So I think that's really important. And we covered this in our previous webinar, but just really showing those healthy habits in the home too. So things like what time are emails being sent, and how are you using those tools, and what are the expectations of everybody else? Just being really, really clear and visible in those things is really important.
Okay, thanks. So we've got 5 minutes left for Q&A. No more questions have come in, but we did have one submitted in advance, which I just thought I would touch upon now. And that was around, in a hybrid world, do all of our team events and meetings have to be hybrid? So do we have to offer a remote option for everyone? And I think this is quite interesting. I think from a culture perspective, we need to get really clear in terms of what are our moments that matter from a cultural perspective for our organization. So what are those points that we actually really want people to come together, where they're going to feel the organizational culture, and it goes a long way to how you, you know, your passion around the organization and being part of that team. So, and I think if there are a few points throughout the year in terms of big company meetings or events or, you know, monthly team meetings that we believe should be in person, it's okay to say, you know, these are our points where we all need to come into the office, because from a cultural perspective, that's going to go a long way to building our culture and how we're all part of the business. And there, you know, that's kind of how we'll work. And then for everything else, I think it's important to offer those virtual options, but just maybe be clear in terms of, you know, which ones are going to be important from a face-to-face perspective, and really try and build that into the DNA in terms of how teams work. And it's okay to set those expectations that they're when we'll come in the office, and for the other times we can be remote if that works for individuals and that's their preferences. So there's not been any other questions submitted.
No, I think that's it from the questions. But if you're very welcome, Gary. But if anything does come to mind as you begin to think about, you know, the your engagement approach and the cultural initiatives you're looking to drive, then definitely feel free to reach out to Claire and myself, and we can share collateral and ideas. And we will follow up with a link to the recording of the session. And we've also created a more extensive version of that checklist, and we'll share that with you as well. So thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.